So as someone with insight into the halls of journalistic and political power in the eastern US, can you explain to those of us outside the system just what exactly has precipitated this apparently unprecedented decline in decorum and all sense of normalcy in what we're viewing, at least from the outside, in the current presidential elections? What do you attribute it to?
It's happening in the Republican Party. The Democratic Party isn't experiencing that same kind of thing. Sanders was an ideological challenge, and he was kind of outside of the system in the sense that he wasn't close to political power. But he didn't represent he didn't kind of represent on a kind of assault on the norms, right? He was kind of like Howard Dean was in 2004, a little more ideologically radical. So I think you're really talking about what's happening inside the Republican Party. Democrats may not love Hillary Clinton, but there's not a white-hot anger at their own elites, their own establishment. That's part of the reason Hillary Clinton was able to beat back Bernie Sanders, that you tend to see in the Republican parties. Because I think in the Republican Party, you had all these failures that were accepted as failures by everybody, plus many of the things that the Democrats saw as actual successes were also failures, right? The fact that they're losing the culture war, that Democrats are in power, and that the shifting demographics of the country mean the Democrats could be in power for a long time. So I think this is produced among a certain subset of the Republican Party. It may not even be a majority of the Republican Party, but a plurality, given the nature of this composition of this field, that created this moment for Trump. And I think it was partly because of how many candidates there were, and it was partly because there were certain pieties that the mainstream candidates were engaged in that were simply didn't recognize the realities that people were expecting. It wasn't only that Trump, it was partly that they were representing a pro-free trade, pro-immigration elite view that many Republicans don't hold, but also that they couldn't even acknowledge that the Iraq war was a mistake. They couldn't acknowledge that the campaign finance system was corrupt. So that I think created this sense of unreality that existed, that a lot of ordinary Republicans kind of rallied around Trump in order to oppose. What's interesting is how much of this is just Donald Trump. So for instance, I think if you were to look at, let's say, Senate and House races, in general, you wouldn't find that those races, in terms of decorum, look a lot different than they have in past years. Now, it's possible that Trump is a leading indicator. We'll have lots of mini kind of Trumps doing what he's doing. If you look at the kind of nature of the debates that you find on CNN and Fox NBC, they're pretty standard. I mean, some of them are now Trump people, but the way in which people are talking to one another, it's not like all of a sudden people are throwing chairs on TV. And so it's actually not been, if you look at Senate and House primaries, for instance, it's not been we're not in an environment where the establishment candidates have been losing to these crazy primary candidates. I mean, Paul Ryan was challenged by this guy, and Paul Ryan won 80% of the vote. So Trump is certainly a horrifying and frightening and also fascinating figure. But I also think one has to be a little bit careful in extrapolating from him into making assumptions about the entire nature of the political and journalistic system.
Is there a concern about access that is tied into the for-profit media model in the United States that is actually driving part of this, do you think?
Look, the standard model for the newspapers, the networks, has been objectivity. And objectivity defined as basically kind of the elites on the different sides are allowed to express their opinion, and both of those opinions are kind of expressed to the viewer, right? With the journalist kind of not saying which is better or worse. I actually think, to be fair, that if you look at the coverage that, certainly if you look at the New York Times and Washington Post, they have strained against that model certainly more than I've ever seen, more than we've ever seen. If you compare this to 2000, for instance, when there was a lot of frustration about the way they covered Bush v. Gore, I think there's more of a willingness on TV, and actually, in print, and even on TV as well, for people to simply say, that statement is wrong, that statement has been repudiated. The challenge is that, first of all, the media landscape is much more fragmented than it was before. So these gatekeepers occupy a smaller market share. I mean, I do think there is concern about alienating Trump and having Trump not coming back on, and Trump has shown an absolute willingness to do that. But I also think even to some degree when people do push back on Trump, again, for his supporters, the fact that they're pushing back doesn't necessarily make them less supportive of Trump. It may make them all the more supportive of Trump because they're already so inclined to believe that the media and other elites are out to get him.
Yeah, that may well be the case in terms of the public perception of the candidate. But as you mentioned, so Trump would just dangle this in front of many, or has at least dangled this in front of many media correspondents, saying, "Oh no, I won't sit down with you unless you treat me in a way that I deem is fair."
Right.
But like you said, the media corporations themselves have a responsibility to, well, actually the advertisers, but also to the public, to have this guy on, in a sense, and show people what he thinks. But it seems, at least from a non-American perspective, to sit back and watch American media, it seems like this circular sort of circus where we have this person on saying crazy things, but we can't call him out for being too crazy, or else we're not going to get him back on to show him saying more crazy things.
Well, I think, again, as far as I know, he's pretty much not doing CNN and MSNBC. So something has happened there where he perceives, at least, they're being tough enough that that shark has been jumped. But on the other hand, it's probably also true that his rallies probably are broadcast more than Hillary Clinton's rallies. And so now they may well, after the rally, go to a panel of commentators who will be very critical of the rally, but so you can criticize them for putting those rallies on. I certainly think in the primary, a lot of Republican other candidates were very, very angry that his rallies got so much coverage. Again, these are institutions that are trying to serve some public interest, and they're also businesses. So his rallies are much, much more entertaining than the rallies of anybody else running for president, right? He's an entertainer. So that's clearly part of the, we saw this in the first debate, which got just epic ratings because everyone wanted to see what Donald Trump was going to do. There's
been this migration towards infotainment as opposed to public service. It just seems kind of jarring, and I don't know if this is a trend or if this is just a one-off thing because of the Trump factor. But okay, so on the issue of showing Trump rallies and also Trump speeches, I remember during the primaries, Bernie Sanders would come out and make speeches after a given primary, but instead of showing the Bernie Sanders speech, they would show the Trump podium, awaiting what Trump was about to say. So there's also this question of Bernie Sanders clearly has been, or was campaigning on a platform of getting money out of politics, which involves, I imagine, legal collusion between the media and their moneyed interests in politics. So to what degree can we chalk up Sanders' success or failure, or the degree to which Americans were made cognizant of his policies or not, to this media dynamic? Do you think that played any role in his success or failure vis-a-vis Hillary Clinton?
First of all, at the beginning, Sanders was not necessarily considered that strong a candidate, so he didn't get that much attention. Then he started to get more attention as it became clear he was doing pretty well. I think it's probably true that on TV, the normal stable of Democratic or progressive, commentators, many of whom were Democratic officials, were mostly Hillary Clinton people, because she had the entire establishment of the party, and the Sanders people didn't have as many of their folks on TV, and I think that's probably true. I think that Sanders' basic problem was a problem that is kind of endemic to certain kinds that you see again and again in Democratic primaries, which is in most presidential races, Democratic primaries, you find a candidate who galvanizes a lot of support among white voters, white liberals, who can't really break through with African Americans and maybe to a lesser degree with Latinos. Bill Bradley against Al Gore, or Paul Tsongas against Bill Clinton. This is a dynamic that we've kind of seen again and again in Democratic primaries, and that's ultimately, Sanders couldn't kind of crack that nut.
From an outsider's perspective, in a relatively multicultural society like Canada, this has been bizarre to us, viewing the American left and seeing how Sanders, with his message, appears to have not been able to get through to minority groups the same way that Hillary Clinton was able to. Maybe you can just explain this to us. It just seems like people are voting against, within the primaries, that people in minorities were voting against their own interests.
Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton have a very, very, very long history of deep relationships within the African American community. They're very, very well-known commodities. They have very, very strong relationship with, the entire black political class, and a strong level of trust. Now, it's not to say that there have not been moments when African Americans have felt betrayed by Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton, but in general, you saw even after Bill Clinton signed welfare reform, for instance, or signed the crime bill, there was a strong emotional connection. Partly, they came up in Arkansas, which is a state with a large African American population. They have been surrounded by African American supporters and aides, and many of Hillary Clinton's closest aides for decades now have been African American, women in particular. Bernie Sanders was represented Vermont, so he was not a known commodity, and I think a lot of it really just came down to that. He did better among younger African Americans, and he did better among African Americans who weren't in the South. But when in the southern states, where such a high percentage of the Democratic Party electorate is African American, remember, even when Barack Obama ran against Hillary Clinton, at first African Americans were supporting Hillary Clinton. It's a very, very, very strong a connection built up over decades and decades. And Sanders, coming in as someone who had almost no experience in campaigning in African American communities, and his first instinct was basically to give a kind of economic message that didn't actually talk about African American specific concerns. I just think he was never able to overcome that.
You've argued that America, unlike other hegemons, can be a moral actor in the stage because it's self-aware, right? Because America can operate within bounds of international law, and it can restrain itself in certain ways. If Trump becomes president, we really don't know what's going to happen, I suppose. If Hillary becomes president, she receives quite a bit of criticism for being exceptionally hawkish, maybe in an overcompensatory manner or otherwise. But to what degree do you think that your thesis holds true under, let's say, a Clinton presidency? Should people on the left who are worried about Clinton's foreign policy record and foreign policy direction be concerned, or is there really no reason for concern?
Which is because, the arguments that I've made had more to do with the way I would like America to behave, rather than the way that America necessarily normally behaves. I think there have been moments when America has behaved more wisely, both at there's some moments at the beginning of the Cold War. I think there were some moments in the 1990s too, where people looked for legitimacy within institutions, even if those were institutions where America had overwhelming power, where like NATO, for instance. It's tricky to figure out what Hillary Clinton's policy. I think she is more hawkish than Barack Obama, but I think the history of American foreign policy tends to have less to do with the predispositions of people and more to do with the circumstances, which is to say, when America has money in the bank, and when it's been quite a long time since America fought a war where a lot of people died, America tends to have more of an appetite for foreign adventurism. So I think in some ways, in talking about Hillary Clinton, it makes more sense to think about what does this moment look like. I do think I think among foreign policy elites, there is a sense that America needs to reassert itself after Barack Obama. But so in that way, it's a little bit like the kind of Carter to Reagan transition, or the transition that even started at the last year of the Carter to Reagan. On the other hand, I still think we are not in anything like the moment we were in the couple of years after 9/11, where there was a sense that the Vietnam syndrome was a distant memory and the public was willing to support really. I think that we are the legacy of Iraq and Afghanistan could still even become more traumatic than it is in terms of how that plays out. I think it means that maybe you're talking about more air power, and maybe you're talking about some more military aid to some people that we like in various places. Again, it's the kind of thing that Reagan did, the kind of thing that Nixon did. I don't think we're in a moment which like the early 1950s or the mid to late 1960s or the Bush era, where you're going to see somebody basically sending tens or hundreds of thousands of American troops anywhere.